can also confirm that I am seeing your presentation here. So I'm seeing the House of Ashes slide. So I'll get out of your way and let you all introduce each other and start your presentation.
Lexie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Sorry, I can't see where everyone is. Okay, standing. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I am Lexie. I am one of the co-founders of the Osmandius Project. I have a lot of podcasts, too many to count, so I shall not do that. But we have posters everywhere. But basically, in my day job, I work at UCLA, woo. But also, I am an avid archaeo gamer and love to talk about gaming. So.
Thank you. I am Megan. Hi, everyone. I'm an Assyriologist. I run the Digital Hammurabi YouTube website, podcast. Anything Digital Hammurabi is probably connected to me somehow. I also host a New Testament podcast with Dr. Bart Ehrman called Misquoting Jesus. I do the Reading Party podcast with Lexie, which is a media reception podcast, which is a lot of fun. You should absolutely check it out. We're doing ancient Egypt at the moment. And I am also not just an archaeo gamer. I enjoy many, many video games, not usually horror video games. So this one was a bit of a departure for me, but it was awesome. And I'm really looking forward to talking to everyone about it.
And I am E.L. Meszaros, and I'm an occasional collaborator of these two, but my full-time job is a doctoral candidate in the field of the history of the exact sciences and antiquity, which means I look not just at Assyriology, but specifically at the sciences in Assyriology. In my spare time, I am an ARG designer, and I do a lot of puzzly type games. So like what Ahmed was talking to us about earlier today. So this is also not maybe my cup of tea, but it was a fun game to play and a really fun game to talk about today.
Sweet. Okay, cool. So I wanted to start everyone off with just kind of a history of this game series and kind of where it fits in so we can better situate ourselves. So it started with a game called Until Dawn, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. It is a story-driven, decision-driven horror game. It was developed in 2013. Meant to be for the PS3 generation, but then they took more time and it actually was released as a PS4 exclusive. But essentially it combined popular horror tropes with a narrative-based game engine, and they put a very heavy dose of Native American mythology into it. And so that's kind of where you got the concept of like totems and butterfly effect and kind of spirits. And this will be a spoiler-heavy presentation. I'm sorry. So if you don't like spoilers, I will try to limit it as best I can. But essentially, this game was so successful that the same developer, Supermassive Games, decided that they wanted to create a smaller, more focused series based kind of on the concept, the overall concept of Until Dawn. So they developed the Dark Pictures anthology. So it is meant to be a series of 8 games. Season 1 is 4 games, and I have them listed here on the screen. So the first one was Man of Medan, which was based on the Ourang Medan myth during World War I of a missing ghost ship, essentially. And so it's kind of based on the mythology of the Manchurian gold. And so some people might call it kind of like a demonic spirit type of thing. Some may not. That is up for debate. Play the game. I highly encourage you, and then you can decide for yourself. The second game was Little Hope. That is based on the Salem witch trials. So that has a lot of spirits and other sort of demonic myths and folklore in there. House of Ashes is actually the third game in the series and the only one so far set in the ancient world, but it is based heavily on the historical mythological curse of Akkad, which we will be talking about today. And the last game in season 1 is The Devil in Me, which is based on basically the famous serial killer H.H. Holmes and his murder castle during the World's Fair in Chicago, I believe. So that one is more based not on mythology so much. Well, modern mythology, but these are the 4 games. And then they have announced the first game in season 2, which will be Directive 8020, which is going to be based in outer space. We have no other information. And then there will be 3 games following that. So that's just to situate everyone in this universe. And so I mentioned the Curse of Akkad, and so we will get right to it. So Megan, take us away. What is the Curse of Akkad? We cannot hear you, Megan.
That's because I had myself muted. Fantastic. Good start. The game takes its historical setting from ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the Akkadian Empire, which is very commonly known as the world's first empire. And it kind of fictionalizes it using this literary composition, The Curse of Akkad, which is a really interesting text. The exact date of the composition isn't really known, but it's probably 100 years at least after the death of King Naram Sin, who is the gentleman in the delightful gold mask that you can see sitting on this throne here. And the text itself describes how the gods of Assyria and Babylonia abandoned the city of Akkad and the king because he essentially desecrates and destroys a Mesopotamian temple, which is the exact opposite of how Mesopotamian kings are supposed to behave. They build temples, they revere the gods, they do not ever destroy them unless they're then going to rebuild them in like a grander, more impressive manner. But Naram Sin obviously does not do this. He is recorded as destroying this temple. Again, this is a literary text. It's probably not based in actual historic reality. But after this temple is destroyed, the king is punished extensively by the god Enlil, who owns the temple. So his revenge is to let these kind of barbaric hordes of a group called the Gutians, attack Babylonia. They wreak complete havoc and chaos, and to try and assuage Enlil's wrath, the rest of the Babylonian gods end up cursing the city of Akkad. And in the text, the city is ultimately destroyed. Now, the story itself has been understood as a later reflection of Naram Sin's suppression of a southern rebellion in the very early years of his reign. Like I said, it can't really be used to reconstruct history. There's no record of Naram Sin destroying the temple, the Acor temple, and he was actually still being worshipped there himself 200 years after these events. And the city of Akkad also wasn't destroyed during his reign. It remained the capital city of the Akkadian Empire after his death. And we didn't see it in that brief little cutscene I showed you, but the opening of the game shows how Naram Sin is both probably insane and also is killed while on the throne in the temple. This, again, not terribly high on the historical accuracy list. He probably died of natural causes instead of, as is shown in the game, being assassinated in a temple by a vampire. Having said that, the Gutians were a real problem for the Akkadian kings. So while this is a fictionalized account of historical events using, I think, very cleverly an ancient text, it is still rooted in some level of historicity. The Gutians are an issue in the Akkadian period. They probably came from the Zagros Mountains in Iran and are often understood to be one of the causes of the end of the Akkadian Empire. Excuse me. Now, the curse itself is kind of referenced throughout the game, and the opening cutscene, the opening introduction, is about 10 minutes long, and it shows Naram Sin in his temple kind of being, like I said, a bit of a mad king and killing a lot of Gutians until he is ultimately himself killed. And I'm going to hand over to EL, who is going to talk a little bit more about the opening cutscene and some of the scientific information behind it.
Yeah, thank you. Because not only does this cutscene set the stage for the sort of narrative that underlines the rest of the game, it also really sets the stage for a lot of the environmental storytelling that the game is going to do. So I want to talk about some things that jumped out to me as a historian of science, but that I think resonate throughout the game as well. So the cutscene begins with a solar eclipse. We're going to start to see the beginnings of that here, and that sort of sets everything in motion, more or less, for the game. And this sets up a cyclical storytelling device for the game itself. The eclipse is something we'll come back to at the end, at the risk of being spoiler heavy, as Lexie warned. the solar eclipse does come back to haunt our protagonists. So it gives us this very cyclical device. And thinking of solar eclipses in terms of cyclical patterns is actually something that was known in Babylonian, in Mesopotamian astronomy. So this really resonates with how we understand their understanding of what a solar eclipse is and why it happens. I'll talk a little bit more about the astronomy in a second here. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that anytime we are seeing a solar eclipse and thinking about Mesopotamian kings, immediately what jumps to mind for me is the substitute king ritual. So the substitute king ritual is another thing that we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit more detail, but it's something that this prologue sets up for us, and those Gutians that Megan was talking about earlier are continuously referenced as sacrifices throughout this opening here, which is, maybe not the most accurate thing, something that Megan will talk about, but describing them as sacrifices really sets them up as part of this ritual aspect. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the astronomy, because in addition to giving us a solar eclipse in the actual cutscene, we're also shown astronomy from Mesopotamia throughout the game. So in a book in one of the characters, Salim's house, we see this astronomical tablet, which is later actually picked up as an artifact within the game itself. So you can see the artifact on the left here and the paper representation on the right, which is seemingly showing the sky divided up into segments, each segment containing a constellation. And we actually have basically that tablet in real life. That very one exists. It's currently housed in the British Museum. And it looks like this. So a couple discrepancies, right? The constellations are maybe not as easy to see on the real tablet, but we can definitely still see this division of the sky into different segments. We can see the occasional lines, maybe on the bottom, middle, right. You can start to see the lines of like some triangles there. These are describing constellations of the sky. So we're seeing real tablets from that have actually been recovered being placed into the game. So someone here is doing their research. But what I think is really interesting from a scientific perspective is this is wildly uncommon for what an astronomical tablet looks like. Most astronomy texts look nothing like this. In fact, they look a little bit more like this. So most astronomy in Mesopotamia was practiced and recorded in particular just in terms of text and usually in terms of numbers. So what you're seeing here is basically like an Excel spreadsheet, columns and columns and columns of numbers of calculated and predicted astronomical data. They weren't all this large. Many of the texts are actually much smaller, maybe like the size of the fist, containing just a couple lines of text. But this is usually how astronomy is practiced. But it all relates to cycles of data. So when will Mars return to the same position in the sky? When will Venus next have its stationary period? Or when will the sun next be eclipsed by the moon? These all refer to cycles. So I think this is calling back to the solar eclipse astronomy that the game sets up right at the beginning, and it's just peppered all throughout the game. I want to talk a little bit now more about the substitute king ritual, just because it's so interesting. This is the solar eclipse reflected in the Mad King Naram-Sin's eyes in the game. Solar eclipses are really noticeable events. Things get dark. Things in the world change. They're visibly pretty astounding. And if you're interested, there's one happening later this year in the US. So if you can make your way to Middle America, you can check it out for yourself. But what this means is that for Mesopotamians, they were viewed ominously. The solar eclipse meant something weighty was going to happen. And usually because this is such a striking event, it meant something ominous was happening to the king. So there's evidence of many omens that said if there's a solar eclipse, something bad will happen to the king. In fact, the king will die. And in order to prevent that from happening, in order to prevent the king from dying, they came up with this plan to actually set up a substitute king on the throne so that all the ill effects of the solar eclipse omen would happen to the substitute rather than the actual king. So there's this huge ritual where someone else is instated on the throne, the king steps aside, the ill effects of the omen happen to the substitute, and then the real king can take his place on the throne again. As you can imagine, if the fate of the substitute king is death, this was often a reward that was granted to prisoners rather than people volunteering for this position. So we can think even of maybe the sacrifices, the Gutian sacrifices in the game as being people who are being prepared to suffer the ill, ominous effects of the solar eclipse that are happening in the game. Now, we don't have evidence of this substitute king ritual from before around 1800, so this is not necessarily in time with when the rest of the game takes place. And for that matter, much of our knowledge of Babylonian eclipse cycles and predictions come from much later too. We're talking Neo-Assyrian or even late Babylonian astronomy at this point. But if we can extrapolate backwards, it seems to fit with the general understanding of this Mesopotamian setting. So let's hop back to talk about some less scientific aspects and some more cultural aspects of the game. Megan?
Absolutely. Thank you, EL. I want to start by just camping a little bit on this human sacrifice angle that EL explained for us. And when you're playing through the game, after the prologue, you take control of characters in 2003. So the whole prologue is set in the ancient past, and then you skip forward a few thousand years. And one of the things that happens while you're exploring the game and exploring the various settings you're put in is that you come into contact with a lot of archaeological excavations and archaeological finds and materials and kind of the paraphernalia that you would find on an archaeological site. So you come up with notes taken by the excavators as well as the artifacts themselves. And if you remember the tablet, the round tablet that we saw a few slides ago, the back of the tablet had a number on it, which is very common for archaeology. You kind of catalog things as you pull them out of the ground. Now, one of the finds that you come up with is this notebook, which has drawings in of a tablet that the excavators found. And it's got very handy notes here that tell us what we're looking at. This one is described as a ritual tablet showing human sacrifice, and showing, they say, this sacrifice being used for the purpose of telling future. That's extispicy, that's looking at someone's entrails, not usually someone, usually an animal, looking at entrails to gauge the god's opinions on things and to kind of work out what the king is supposed to do in any given situation. Now, human sacrifice is not terribly common in Mesopotamia. The substitute king ritual is definitely a place where you do see it sometimes. If you're familiar also with the royal tombs of Ur, which again in time is a lot earlier than this period, we do have a fair amount of human sacrifice occurring in those, but it's not something that is come back to or that is terribly normal or regular for Mesopotamian ritual. However, the way that this is being used in the game is very interesting to me because they're taking something that is not usual for the historical period or for the cultures that we're looking at, but using it in a way that is attested. So using humans for extispicy, not so much something we are familiar with, but extispicy itself was a very real, very important part of Babylonian and Akkadian culture and religion. I also wanted, I don't think I have a slide for it. I don't. I also wanted to note that in the prologue, you are told that there are tombs in the temple intended for the builders. So after the builders complete the temple, they are supposedly thrown into these tombs and killed. And again, not historically or not rooted in a lot of historicity, but does relate to something we do know from Mesopotamian culture, in that after a craftsperson created a divine statue, a statue of a god or a goddess, which is supposed to be the avatar, I suppose, of the god in the physical realm. Once that's been created, craftspeople were required to swear an oath that they did not have any hand in creating it, which, makes sense if you have an entity that is supposed to be a physical embodiment of a god. It can't be made by humans. That's not a thing that happens. So they were required to swear that they had no hand in it and then essentially get rid of their tools. So this sacrifice, this removal of the builders from the temple seems to me analogous to the king getting rid of the tools he used to create a divine building. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of this slide that after the prologue, you switch over to 2003 for the playable section of the game. I'm going to hand over to Lexie to have a conversation about the time choice and the location. of what happens next.
Okay, well, thank you, Megan. So right before we kind of go into the modern setting, I will just harken us back for a moment to our prologue. So what we are presented with is we have an ancient empire, and what we have strikingly in the beginning is, a representation of the Gutians, this tribe that we've been talking about. And the thing is that the visual representation of the Gutians on screen is interesting because the historical sources tell us that they are kind of a tribal group coming down from the Zagros Mountains, kind of from probably Iran, honestly. So they portrayed it as a very Africanized looking person who probably came from maybe Libya. I don't really know where. It's really not clear. So even in the ancient segments, though, they kind of presented us with an orientalized, Africanized picture of what we think a quote-unquote barbarian would look like. That is kind of problematic. But in the context of the ancient world, I think maybe the game devs were thinking, okay, well, we just need something that looks different from our from our Akkadian protagonist. I have no idea. That is up to speculation. But then bringing it to the more modern aspect. So unfortunately, like what is common in all of these game series is that it does kind of switch back and forth between some sort of historical period and some more modern timeline. They kind of vary the years chronologically in the series. This one is the furthest back in time, as it is in 2003 during the American invasion of Iraq. So essentially in this game, you do pick up and you spend the most, the majority of the game playing as sort of a battalion of Marines and I think one CIA operative, essentially. And the pretext really is that they are flown into Saddam Hussein's like former palace, and now they are on an expedition out into the desert to go find his hidden cache of weapons of mass destruction. So again, you're presented with this sort of savior trope of the Americans coming in, freeing the quote unquote population and looking to sort of destroy the evildoer, the power. So again, this is very, very much paralleled. And I will say that the decision to set this game specifically in 2003 during the Iraq War with these very strong political connotations was not without controversy when the game first dropped, because using sort of the ancient world and really any ancient empire, any ancient conflict, there's nothing specific that means it has to be set here, somewhere in the Iraqi desert. But again, they made some interesting choices. So one of our playable characters we mentioned is named Salim, and he is actually a character who comes from the Iraqi army, and sort of has to intermingle and somehow come to some agreements to survive the game with his American enemies. And again, this is kind of striking, as in the prologue, you have a Gutian and an Akkadian, and there's a very strong undercurrent in this game that is really not subtle at all. There's many playable sections where it is literally told to you through dialogue. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they literally are telegraphing kind of where they're going and what they're doing with this. But it is quite notable, though, that the same kind of inaccuracies are present where they've chosen to make the portrayal of the Americans quite accurate. I would say very hyper accurate. They tried their best with the historical Akkadians, but again, there was not a lot of care paid to the Gutians. Again, Iranian, but they look African. Same thing here with the modern day Iraqis. They're supposed to be modern day Iraqis, and yet one thing that a friend pointed out to me is that while they do attempt to speak in Arabic and show difference, our lead character is speaking with a very, very strong Egyptian Arabic accent, which I was like, that also does not know. So Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I've chosen deliberately not to get too analytical about these political and historical parallels because I'm hoping that people will reach different conclusions. I'm hoping to leave it a little open to interpretation. I don't want to just sort of inundate everyone with my conclusions, but I thought it was quite important to point this out as this is a game that had more contention than the others. And that is pretty much from all the research I could do solely based on the time period and specific setting, because there were a lot of questions of you can choose the whole trope of buried ancient civilization anywhere in the desert. Why does it have to be 2003? Why does it have to be Saddam Hussein? Why does it have to be weapons of mass destruction? So it was quite striking to put that level of political discourse in what is supposed to be just a fun tropey horror game, but we can talk about that later if people would like. So I will hand it back over to Megan for the next section.
Thank you, EL. Sorry. There we go. So I'm going to very quickly just whiz through some of the artifacts that you see in the game, because I think the ancient objects here are used very well to create quite compelling worlds, both ancient and modern. And one thing that we will see as we go through is kind of a collage of artifacts from different time periods, from different geographical locations that have all been stitched together to try and provide this very broadly, generally Mesopotamian background. This is, they name it as being in Akkad. We don't know really where Akkad is. There's some suggestion that it might be under modern day Babylon, but it's not a city that archaeologists have found or excavated. And we don't have an awful lot in the way of architecture or art from this period, again, because we don't have the capital city. So instead of trying to fill in the gaps and make it up, what the game developers have done, I think very cleverly, and I think quite effectively, is to take artifacts and art from different Mesopotamian cultures and weave them in to try and create this world that your characters are exploring through kind of an archaeological / don't get killed by vampires lens. It's a very interesting gaming experience, because as an Assyriologist, I'm wandering through this amazing ruined temple thinking, oh, it's a Neo-Assyrian palace relief. This is spectacular. Oh my God, is there a vampire around the corner? Am I going to die now? Yes, it was an experience. But we're opening with this lovely cylinder seal. You see the image on the left. It's around the neck of a Gutian gentleman that you find in the prologue. This is a very accurate representation. Cylinder seals were used both to sign documents and to indicate ownership, but they were also worn around the neck as kind of apotropaic protective amulets. So seeing them as jewelry is not out of what one would expect. And then later on in the game, when you're playing as one of the Marines, you find a cylinder seal and you can kind of pick them up and move them around and see how the light catches the different carvings. I will say that seeing it on a Gutian neck is a little interesting. Cylinder seals are first and foremost for record keeping, and would not have been terribly useful to pastoral nomads who presumably did not pay taxes to some kind of central authority, but it was really nice to see one being included. Interestingly, the Akkadian doesn't seem to know what it is. This gentleman is accompanied by an Akkadian general through the prologue, who asks, what is that around your neck? And the Gutian gentleman tells him, oh, it records the history of the Guti, which it doesn't. That's not what cylinder seals do. And an Akkadian general would be very, very familiar with what a cylinder seal was, and indeed what it did. So that was a little bit, just tweaked my brain a little bit. It was an interesting interaction. We also have a lot of Pazuzu imagery, and he is a monstrous figure. He's understood as a demon, but he's kind of a protective demon. He protects against plague and another demon, Lamashtu. And EL will get a little bit more into Pazuzu later on, but we see again on the left this lovely bronze figurine, and I think this is quite an obvious corollary. The one on the right is housed in the Louvre at the moment. Again, this is perfectly Like that's a reasonable representation, right? We also see these guys, definitely still Pazuzu, but massive Pazuzus. And he's even more monstrous, I think, than he previously was. And I don't know if he was chosen because he's understood as a demon, if it's because the name is one that people are more familiar with because of other media, or it's because he just looks like a scary guy. I mean, he's got the lion head, he's got the giant eagle wings, there's a snake penis and an eagle like clawed feet going on there. And you come across this particular statue at a point in the game where you've fallen who knows how many 100 feet into a river of blood. It's delightful. And you round a corner and there's this giant, massive Pazuzu statue. And it gives both the effect of showing you that you are in a very different time and space to where you started the game. And it's also unnerving because even though in the ancient world, Pazuzu was a protective, benevolent figure, seeing him is an unsettling experience, even if you know that he is supposed to be benevolent and protective because his appearance is so monstrous. Speaking of monstrous appearances, we also have a couple of Lamassu that feature in the prologue. You'll see these. It's quite, oh gosh, sorry. It's a bit blurry, but we've got one either side of here. Again, these are protective deities. They're typically found in palaces rather than temples. And these are from the Neo-Assyrian period, so a lot later in history than the time period that we're currently working with. They're also kind of misplaced. And interestingly, this is noted in another one of the archaeological notes that you can find as you're walking through the game. You pick up a notebook. I couldn't find a screenshot, but you pick up a notebook and it's got a drawing of a Lamassu with a little notation saying they're usually found in palaces. Essentially, what are they doing in the middle of a temple? Which was fascinating. There's no answer given. I don't know why they're in a temple, but it was really cool to see the devs kind of nodding to the fact that they know they're using these artifacts in a slightly strange way and having the archaeologists pick up on it and say, what is going on here? So this is how you would usually expect them to be. They're not in the middle of a room. They are placed either side of a doorway, again, as a protective force to stop anything bad or evil entering through that door. And this is just another shot of the exterior of the temple. I included it because we obviously had the interior here. I don't have any idea if this is how the interior of a Mesopotamian temple would have actually looked. It's very impressive. I really enjoyed it. The exterior is huge. And obviously you've got this ginormous statue like kind of seated at the front, which is like, there's no record of that at all. But what I did enjoy is you see the kind of niches and buttresses in the background over here. That's very standard. We've got these lovely, what look like glazed blue bricks, which are very reminiscent of the Ishtar Gate. Again, wrong time, wrong place, but it's really interesting that someone has thought enough about like decorative techniques in Mesopotamia to think to include that. We also, on the interior, like I said, as I was wandering around the ruins temple, you see a lot of these reliefs, and they are very obviously modeled on Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs. This one, I think, is in the Met Museum. You can see the Apkallu, the protected genie there to the left of General Balathu. And what they've very cleverly done is, again, not only taken something wrong time, wrong place, but they've edited the imagery to make it more relevant to the game. So the Apkallu in the Met Museum has this like pinecone thing going on. He's performing some kind of, again, apotropaic protective ritual intended to look after the king and the well-being of the empire. And in the game, the protective accoutrements have been replaced with what look like daggers and then some kind of forked stabby thing. I don't know what it's technically called, but I would not like to be on the receiving end of that. So it takes it and it shifts it to fit, I think, more with the like violent, aggressive, deeply unnerving aspect of the game, and to create this very thoroughly Mesopotamian world that you're walking through and you're playing through, but one that is a bit more sinister, a bit darker than you might have experienced if you were walking past these temple reliefs, these palace reliefs in the palaces. I do wonder why they didn't use some of the more violent Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs. We have a lot of like warfare imagery. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say it's because these are they're more supernatural, right? And the whole game is based on this like supernatural vampire monster alien type thing. So I think it probably just fits better, but it would have been interesting to see some of the warfare reliefs in here. I think it would have added just a little bit of detail there. And this is, again, another Neo-Assyrian palace relief. This is the famous lion hunt. And you can see this little stone plaque. You find these spread throughout the game. And when you pick one up, it kind of gives you a premonition as to what's about to happen next. I don't really know anything from Mesopotamian history that fits this kind of small portable stone carving format, I suppose. But I think you can very definitely see that the style of carving that they're using is drawing very heavily again on Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs there. And finally, like E.L. mentioned a little bit earlier, we've got the fascinating use of cuneiform. You can't have a game drawing on Mesopotamian history without including cuneiform. But the way they've done it, especially for this particular tablet, is very odd. So the tablet on the right, like E.L. was saying, they're small. There are a lot of very small tablets, and they are incised using a reed stylus. So this is kind of what we would expect. You can see there's a hand there that I think really gives a sense of scale. The one on the right, again, has a hand, which gives you another sense of scale. And it is the biggest cuneiform writing I think I've seen that isn't like on a palace relief and hasn't been carved in using a hammer and a chisel. This is ostensibly has been written using a stylus. And I think I said when we were practicing that it looks like a giant has written it. But it's fascinating to me that they clearly knew that they should be including cuneiform in a tablet of some kind, but they got the scale so drastically wrong. And I was wondering when I was preparing for this, if it was a deliberate attempt to show people more clearly, like this is cuneiform, this is what it looks like. But then I came across the cylinder seal, which is an appropriate size. So I don't know if it was a deliberate choice or merely someone got a little bit confused as to how big cuneiform writing typically is. So for me, the presentation of all of these objects, and you come across many of them, like I said, in archaeological contexts. They've been labeled, they've been catalogued. These are finds that someone at some point was planning on transporting to a museum. Presenting them as archaeological finds, for me, created a modern world that was really interested in exploring and understanding the ancient past. And the fact that there are notebooks and there are scaled drawings and plans of the temple scattered around the archaeological site really felt very familiar as someone who's had a very limited archaeological experience, but it felt familiar. I'm going to pass over now to E.L., who's going to continue the Pazuzu discussion and look at the use of cuneiform in horror as a genre.
Yeah, thanks, because it's, we're nearing the end of our presentation, so we wouldn't want to finish up without talking about how this game engages with the larger horror genre. We've talked a lot about the individual components of the game, all these artifacts, all the things that make it clear that we're drawing from Mesopotamian cultures, but how do those Mesopotamian cultures then in turn engage with horror? And Pazuzu is the easiest one to point to, right? There's a long horror tradition of drawing from Sumerian and Babylonian imagery, particularly with Pazuzu. So if you're not someone who's seen The Exorcist, like me, actually, you may not know this, but this is famously the demon at the heart, at the root of the evil of The Exorcist, which is, by this time in 2024, a fairly old film. And so this name has been in pop culture and been in media for a long time and been something that people who are interested in that type of horror movie have engaged with. But I think we've seen more and maybe an uptick in how this genre is in particular drawing from the Mesopotamian cultures. I think this is something that we're seeing a lot more frequently in games and in podcasts and in some more modern media, but where it's definitely something we're seeing in movies and books as well. And I don't have a good answer for why that is, but I have some ideas that I want to talk about here. In particular, there's a sense of almost familiarity almost in the horror genre with the old standbys for magical spells and components of the supernatural. So the Latin of spell books and the Greek imagery is so familiar now that it's been done, it's rote. And I think a lot of creators are trying to seek something a little stranger, a little more othering, and they're to do so drawing from the Mesopotamian traditions, which is not necessarily fair, right? Like, this is not othering to many different cultures, but it's not strange to many people who still exist in the world. As Lexie described in her discussion of the politics of this, this is not without its problematic orientalizing features here. But I think it's something that we're seeing more frequently in modern times. And I think one way that that is maybe making itself clear is the ways in which the imagery is being used in, I'll say, inappropriate or maybe non-traditional ways. So as Megan discussed, the statue of Pazuzu is way bigger than anything we've seen in the actual archaeological record. But this giant size is something that gets reproduced across other media and through other individual shows. So I have a couple of examples if you want to go to the next slide, Megan. So this is from the modern TV show Lucifer, if anyone is familiar with that. Not necessarily a horror show, but certainly a supernatural show. And this packing crate, what do you call these giant crates here? This
Shipping container.
Shipping container, thank you, contains his wings as an angel. And if you can sort of see on the side there in white is outlined a painted cuneiform sign. And I thought this was wildly interesting because it's drawing the correlation between Lucifer and the cuneiform language, right? This is the older version of the sign that means God or also sky, a couple other things, right? But it's also way bigger than cuneiform would have any reason to be. It's like the tablet that Megan was showing. It's much too large to be effective. It's also painted on as opposed to chiseled out or impressed in with a wedge. So it just shows this different style. And I think it's that same large style that we're seeing with the Pazuzu statue in the underground temple as well. There are other ways that we can tell that cuneiform traditions, Mesopotamian traditions are being utilized without necessarily being understood or being utilized for their strangeness. So the next slide has another example of this. This is from a game that I quite enjoy called Paradise Killer, which came out in 2020. It's sort of an open world murder mystery solver. Really fun, but it's despite having modern amenities, the characters in the game have cars and computers. They're active in the electronic age. The world is riddled with cuneiform that's just scattered as art objects throughout. But the cuneiform, as you're seeing here, has been placed on its side. So it's not right side up. It's in a way that you would have to tilt your head to read. And perhaps this could be viewed as an artistic choice, right? If this really is an art object, but in this case, we know it was an accident because we reached out to the game developers who said, oops, we didn't know that that was not the way that the cuneiform went. And so there is an understanding that as cuneiform is being used in these modern horror media, it's being done so in a way without necessarily understanding just for what it evokes. And in this sense, I think we can start to see in House of Ashes, there's definite understanding being put into what artifacts are being chosen, how they're being used. There's definite research going into it, but there's still this horror genre trend of using them in ways that they would not have appeared in the ancient world to engage further with the genre itself, because horror expects us to use these out of place and in new environments that evoke this sort of strangeness. And so with that, I want to pass it back to Lexie here to maybe bring us home.
Sure. Happy to. So yeah, there's a lot of elements, and the reason that I think I conceived of having 3 people do this is because I hope that throughout this talk, we've proven that like a lot of these elements that we've looked at can be used kind of individually, but I think what makes the game kind of unique really is that you have so many, it's very clear that a lot of research has been done in certain areas, others not really at all, and then you kind of layer on modern conceptions and biases onto it, and it creates this really trifold experience where my first reaction when picking this game up as someone who loves the ancient world, I mean, not being an Assyriologist, I could not speak to a lot of, is this right? Is this not? But just as someone who knows the politics and the history, I found it a very interesting choice that, this game series is unique because of the fact that it's never been shy about saying we're going to pick a specific trope or two, build off of it, combine them, and produce a game. It's so I find it very interesting that you would finally have a game set in the ancient world like a lot of people enjoy, but I do feel that the experience is kind of, um I don't want to say marred, but it's notable for the kind of ostensible story they had to build around. And so I find the world building of it all quite curious, that you have some things that are so accurate and so inaccurate, um, in a way that the other games in the series are not. I mean, they all have their issues, but this is the most on the nose, kind of politically, historically, in terms of strong parallels. I mean, the only thing out of place really is kind of, they said that the game devs in a video somewhere said that like the inspiration for this game essentially was Curse of Akkad mixed with James Cameron's Aliens film. And I was like, well, I guess it makes sense because foreign world, were they going for the more aliens type of, yeah, it's like Space Marines with aliens, or is this like historically based? We don't know. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to talk about. I hope you have learned something. And yeah, excited to kind of talk with you guys about what you guys think. And if you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. Even if you are not a fan of horror, which I don't think, I mean, Megan and I are not, but it was still fun to play because we can find, historical things and other themes. Yeah.
Hi. I went so fast to you because I was just very curious about something that's been bubbling while you guys were talking. Do you guys think that I always had this in mind
I am
that
I think
so
you could
sorry
just
to
step forward
interrupt.
into that white
You need to
box and you
step
might be
forward
able to.
one. I'm hearing you. There we go. Please repeat your question.
okay, thank you. All right. Well, good thing I didn't get to my question. So the thing is that I have a feeling, so I'd like to share with you to see what you think. That that people generally like to use these ancient cultures from Mesopotamia and all around as evil because of some influence from Christianity in society, like because the Bible paints them as evil, like from Babylonia, from Mesopotamia, from I don't know, I don't remember right now from the top of my head, but this kind of places, as the same as how people like to think that the Greek and the Roman were very enlightened and noble and such a perfect balanced society. So what do you guys think? Do you guys feel that this could be an influence to us why horror games have these choices?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, especially for horror games coming out of the U.S., out of places that have been influenced by Christian culture for sure. One of the things that I think is interesting about that though is that we still for the longest time have had this association of like witchcraft, a very evil, a very what I gathered non-Christian component with the Latin language, right? So even though there's this sense in the Western world of how important Greece and Rome are to the development, there's still this association of evilness and the sense of witchcraft with the Latin language. And I think
Oh,
there's a reason that they haven't switched over into something like Akkadian or other languages, and it's just that they're less accessible to the creators of this media too. So it's definitely something to consider. It's absolutely something that I think impacts these directors for sure.
thank you very much for your question. We now have Megan, who has another question. Please go ahead. Megan Sullivan, that is.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. So it's so funny. This leads right into my question, which is we just heard that in many ways, these ancient Mesopotamian gods are portrayed as evil. But I play a lot of Japanese RPGs and they're sort of more agnostic about religion. And so some of these creatures will actually be sometimes enemies, sometimes allies you can summon into battle. Are there any particular gods you'd like to see in a more positive light as an ally or even as a player avatar that you think would be really cool for a game? Have you ever given that any thought?
I would love to see the Anzu bird somewhere. That would be, because he's so tricky and so mischievous, and also, you know, super powerful. I think he'd be a really cool character. Him and I would love like a Gilgamesh RPG. Like you'd play through the epic. That would be a lot of fun. And I think there's a really broad scope there. You've got like the romantic relationship or the like really close friendship relationship with Enkidu. You've got the killing of monsters and you've got like city building. It's got everything. I think it would be a great game.
Oh man, too many. But if I'm picking from Mesopotamia, I've always been fascinated by seeing, like, if you take modern reception materials, if you do have any discussion about the gods, Marduk is always kind of like associated with the villain. He's like the patron of the villainous character in a lot of modern reception stuff. And I really kind of wondered why, like, I know why on some level, but I'm also like, I would really actually like to see someone take Marduk and not associate him with like the antagonist. And let's just make a really cool thing where Marduk is like the hero somehow. I don't know. Somehow.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Well, excellent questions from the audience here. I want to welcome any others who are considering something.
You're muted, Dan.
Thank you for letting me know. Thank you as well, everyone, for your questions. That's an excellent one so far. I'm not sure if our presenters can see the chat, but just want to let you know you're getting some love there from Julie, Megan, VUL, and others. So please keep sharing that. Always happy to see it. But we do have our lunch hour following up here in the next few minutes, so we have plenty of time for more questions if you have some. So I'll welcome anyone else who has those or even comments. Those are also welcome as well. And actually, I lied. I have a question myself I want to ask. Seeing Lexie's message that everyone should play the game. Unfortunately, some of us do not have PlayStations, much to my dismay. So, with that in mind,
It's on PC.
Oh, it is. Good to know. But hypothetically, somebody doesn't have a console to play this. Are there any streamers or streams of this game you'd recommend?
There are several.
Yeah.
There are several on YouTube. There are so many different playthroughs. One thing I definitely didn't mention at the beginning, but it wasn't super relevant to our presentation, but I guess I'll mention it now. The part of the reason that this game series was made and modeled after Until Dawn was because of the success of. So Until Dawn was made essentially as a single player game. It's pretty long though. It's like a 9-10 hour playthrough, and the game devs were getting a lot of feedback that because you would play kind of each chapter with one character and it would switch around, people would like invite their friends over for a game night, and then they would essentially take the controller, assign friends in the group a character, and you would pass off the controller, and then it would become this sort of co-op experience in the room. So a lot of game nights, and that was probably one of the most positive features. And so Supermassive decided that because it was such a success, they wanted to tailor this new series to its strengths. So essentially, they created these games as a shorter version, so that way you weren't sitting there for 9-10 hours, because that's a really long time. So most of these games are between 4 and I think the longest one is Devil and Me, and that if you complete everything is probably about 6.5 to 7 hours. Um, but they're supposed to be shorter, and then they have 2 built-in modes that are supposedly better than the single player, which is there is like a in-room co-op where you can just pass the controller around and it sort of gives you prompts. But there is an online co-op mode, so if they don't do cross-platform gaming yet, but assuming you both have PC or PlayStation, it's meant to be played where you and a friend will see different scenes playing different characters, but your decisions will affect each other. And it's kind of great. So that is kind of the highlight. And so there are 2 modes and different playthroughs. So you have to be careful when you're searching through the playthroughs, because sometimes you'll get people who are co-oping, so you'll have the one streamer, but then you'll maybe hear someone else's voice but not see their characters, so you might be a little confused. So just make sure that if you're going to try to find a thorough playthrough, just make sure you know what you're looking for. So if you want to see kind of the whole game, I would say try to find one streamer who's playing the single person version. Yeah.
That is an abundance of options.
You're muted again, Dan.
Thank you for the reminder. I was not broadcasting. Thank you again for that abundance of options, Lexie. I now just have to go through the challenge of deciding which one to start with. So I think that is going to be it for our questions, and we are just at the top of the hour here. So any other comments from our panelists before we close out of our morning of If What's in History Day 1 and go to our lunch hour?
I just want to say it was really, really... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Megan.
I just wanted to say it was really, really cool to see a game with so much Mesopotamian reception. It's not an area of history that gets the love, I think, obviously, as an Assyriologist, I think it deserves. It was nice to see, and it was, for all that some areas were not as well researched as I think they could have been, it was still done, I think, with a lot of care and a lot of attention to detail. They didn't just throw a bunch of stuff in and hope for the best. It was a well done game.
Yes. Yeah. I am always kind of shocked by how some small things in each of these games in the series, as I've played all of them, like there are really fascinatingly correct small details, which then serve to annoy me when like there's a big thing that I feel should be right and then it's not, and then I'm like, why? Because the small thing is so good. That's just the difficulty for any historical game, I think. But I just wanted to also mention that if anyone is interested in certain streams or recommendations, I am happy to provide them. Just reach out to me and I can do so.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your farewell waves. I will now dismiss you all and encourage everyone to go ahead and please take a break. Check out the exhibition hall. You're free to walk around the space. You can close out of Gathertown and return back to it if you wish. Any way you choose to approach that is fine. But just a sneak peek at the next part of our agenda here is after our lunch break, we'll be returning at 2 p.m. Central Time, so 1 hour from now. And this will be a presentation by Julie Levy by All the Wake and Waters, Language and World Building in Heaven's Vault. So again, that'll be this afternoon at 2 p.m. Central Time, just about 60 minutes from now. So I hope you all enjoy your lunch breaks, and we'll see you back soon.